In the oppressive heat of the summer of 1716, 14 of South Carolina's wealthiest plantation owners arrived at the Grayfield estate, expecting a routine business meeting. 3 days later, not a single one remained alive. What investigators found defied belief. Charred bodies arranged in a perfect circle around a massive coal furnace, each bound in iron shackles, mouths stuffed with raw cotton. The only person left alive was a slave woman named Esperanza de Lima, discovered serenely humming a Portuguese lullaby in the kitchen while sharpening knives with eerie precision. When asked what had happened, she simply replied in broken English, "Justice burns slower than coal, but burns complete." The colonial authorities quickly sealed the case by order of Governor Robert Johnson, locking away the truth in Charleston's archives for over 200 years. Tonight we uncover the long-buried truth of the Grayfield Massacre. A tale of vengeance so precise and relentless it would change the colony's perception of slavery forever. But before we explore the story of Esperanza de Lima and the night that shook colonial South Carolina, take a second to subscribe and hit the notification bell. These are the kinds of stories time tried to erase, and we're here to bring them back. Also, drop a comment to tell me which state you're watching, from who knows what dark secrets might be hiding in your own backyard. Now, let's go back to 1716 and meet the woman who was once seen as nothing more than property, and how she orchestrated one of the most calculated acts of revenge in early American history. Her story doesn't begin on that night of fire and fury, but 15 years earlier in the bustling, humid port of Charleston. It was 1701, and the colony was thriving. Its wealth built on the backs of enslaved Africans laboring on rice plantations along the coastal lowlands. Among the colony's elite was Edmund Grayfield, a second-generation settler whose family had claimed over 3,000 acres of swampland north of the Ashley River. Towering and cold-eyed Grayfield was infamous even by the brutal standards of his time. His plantation Grayfield estate was spoken of in whispers among slaves across the region. Those sent there either died quickly or emerged irreparably broken. In September of 1701, the Portuguese slave ship Santa Maria docked in Charleston Harbor, carrying 180 captives from Angola. Among them was a young woman of about 20 who would be given the name Esperanza de Lima. To the slave traders and planters, she appeared ordinary, average in size, seemingly healthy. But her dark, perceptive eyes and intricate scarification hinted at a deeper story they couldn't understand. She was of royal blood, daughter of a powerful tribal chief trained in strategy diplomacy, and what colonists would have ignorantly called witchcraft. She had watched Portuguese raiders burn her village, kill her father, and enslave her people. From that moment on, she saw every white man as part of the same enemy. Grayfield purchased her for 40 sterling, a high price, reflecting her youth and apparent strength, with the intention of replacing his previous house slave, who had recently died under suspicious circumstances after spilling wine on his imported rug. From the moment she arrived at Grayfield, Esperanza began her campaign not of resistance, but of calculation. She learned English quickly, though pretended not to. She listened to conversations, cataloged the names and secrets of the colony's elite, and watched as their trust grew. Grayfield Estate wasn't just a home, it was the secret meeting place of the Rice Council, a group of 14 plantation owners who held near total control over South Carolina's agriculture and, by extension, its politics. These men considered themselves untouchable, crafting laws to protect their profits and reinforce their power. They were kings in everything but name. At the center of it all was Edmund Grayfield, their de facto leader. Among the others were William Peaton, the colony's top rice producer; James Rutherford, a colonial judge; Marcus Sutton, who ran the largest slave trading route between Charleston and Savannah; and Henry Caldwell, whose political influence reached the governor's office. There was Thomas Harrington, an ex-naval officer, turned plantation tyrant, and Benjamin Fairfax, whose family wealth stretched back to the colony's founding. Together they shaped South Carolina's future with the stroke of a pen. And all the while, Esperanza was watching, biding her time, remembering every face, every atrocity, every weakness. For 15 years she waited. Then one summer night she struck, and what followed changed everything. Samuel Kingsley specialized in preparing newly arrived African slaves for labor. Robert Fielding earned notoriety for his grotesque innovations in torture. Charles Warwick, whose plantation bordered 3 others, functioned as a regional hub of information and surveillance. Jonathan Crichton meticulously documented every aspect of slave breeding programs. David Norris, with a background in medicine, was adept at prolonging the lives of the enslaved just long enough to extract every ounce of labor. Alexander Hartwell ran a holding facility for recaptured runaways, turning his plantation into a private prison. And then there was George Baxter, the youngest, at just 35, whose unchecked enthusiasm for violence had secured his place among this elite circle of colonial sadists. These weren't just cruel men. They were methodical, calculating, and deeply invested in the commodification of human life. They shared strategies for psychological domination, debated caloric regimens to maximize output with minimum cost, and openly bragged about their most creative punishments. For 15 years, Esperanza de Lima moved silently among them during their monthly gatherings at Grayfield Estate. She poured their wine, cleared their plates, and absorbed every word. She heard them laugh about tearing families apart, weigh the pros and cons of branding versus whipping, and casually plan the expansion of their slave empires. But her hatred wasn't fueled by slavery's general horror alone. It was ignited by something deeply personal. In the spring of 1715, everything changed for Esperanza. After years of quiet endurance, she had done something unthinkable. Under the conditions she lived in, she fell in love. His name was Wame, though the records reduced him to Boy Tom. Born on the Rutherford plantation in 1693, Wame was 22 when Esperanza first noticed him. Against all odds, he'd retained his intellect and strength despite the brutality of the slave-breaking process. He had secretly learned to read from a now-deceased overseer and was quietly passing that knowledge to others on Sundays. Their relationship began as a strategic partnership, exchanging intel about their owner's routines and plans, but gradually deepened into something tender and dangerous. They developed a covert communication system of songs and gestures that passed unnoticed by white observers. By late 1715, they had constructed one of the most sophisticated resistance networks in colonial South Carolina. Esperanza gathered intelligence from the Rice Council meetings, while Wame, who was often leased out to neighboring plantations, spread messages and built alliances. Together they were planning not just to escape, but to ignite a rebellion that could free hundreds. They had contacts in free black community, in Spanish Florida, mapped safe houses, and even found sympathetic whites who were willing to help. Everything was in place. Then on March 15, 1716, the plan unraveled. During a council meeting, Edmund Grayfield casually announced the expansion of his breeding program. Select female slaves chosen for their physical traits would be forcibly paired with males from other plantations. Esperanza's name topped the list. She served wine and smiled as she always did, but inside something shattered. Hope had been her armor. Hope for escape, revenge, love, and freedom. Now Grayfield intended to strip even that from her, reducing her to nothing more than livestock. That night she met Wame beneath a fallen cypress deep in the rice fields. He had made contact with a Spanish trader who could smuggle them into St. Augustine within days. They could leave that night, disappear, survive. but Esperanza said no. "Running saves us," she told him in Portuguese, the language they reserved for their most private truths. "But it changes nothing for our people." Her decision was final. They would not flee. They would burn the system down. These men will never stop. More ships will come. More families will be torn apart. More children will be born into chains. Esperanza had spent 15 years watching the Rice Council inflict generational pain with cold efficiency. She had seen them laugh about destroyed families, discuss torture like it was kitchencraft, and draft plans for expanding their empire of suffering. She had memorized their routines, their vices, and their blind spots. "I know when they're vulnerable," she told Wayne. "We have one chance to make them feel the fear they've made us live with. One chance to send a message that will never be forgotten." Wayne understood what she meant, and it terrified him not the possibility of death, but the certainty of torture if they failed. He'd seen the aftermath of slave uprisings. The public executions, the mutilated bodies displayed to crush any thoughts of resistance. But he also knew she was right. Escaping would save 2 lives and leave the system untouched. Her plan, though dangerous beyond comprehension, had the potential to strike at slavery itself. Maybe it wouldn't end it, but it might slow it down, or at least force the oppressors to think twice. Over the next 2 weeks, they transformed pain into purpose. Esperanza used her unique position at the Rice Council meetings to set the stage. Wami coordinated logistics, moving supplies, crafting alibis for sympathetic slaves, and preparing for every possible outcome. What they devised wasn't just rebellion, it was strategy. Intelligence operation, psychological warfare, tactical assault. And it all hinged on one truth Esperanza had discovered over a decade and a half of quiet observation. The Rice Council members believed they were untouchable, and that belief had made them careless. The target was set June 23, 1716. The morning of the meeting arrived under the crushing heat of a South Carolina summer. The kind of humidity only those born under the equatorial sun could endure without complaint. Esperanza rose before dawn, as she always had. But today was different. Today marked the end of patience, the beginning of reckoning. The Rice Council meeting was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. 14 plantation owners would arrive at Grayfield Estate, expecting an afternoon of brandy-soaked debate and brutal camaraderie. Most meetings lasted 4 to 6 hours, depending on how much rum was poured. Esperanza had memorized the entire rhythm: who arrived early, who lingered late, who drank the most, who couldn't hold their liquor. She knew Marcus Sutton always showed up first. She knew Benjamin Fairfax would slip away for the privy every 90 minutes. She knew rice prices came before supper, and that by the time dessert was served, the conversation would shift to slave discipline and breeding strategies. Most importantly, she knew the kitchen furnace. Imported from Britain in 1695, it was Grayfield's pride, a coal-burning behemoth that dwarfed the wood hearths found in most colonial homes. It stood 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, made of imported fire brick and reinforced iron. When fully fueled, it could sustain temperatures hot enough to melt metal. Grayfield loved to show it off to guests as a symbol of his wealth and innovation. What he didn't know was that Esperanza had been quietly mastering it, learning how to maintain its heat control airflow and push it to its limits. For months, she had stockpiled extra coal, explaining to the overseers that Mr. Grayfield planned to expand food production. No one questioned her. Then, 3 days before the meeting, news came that sealed her fate. Wayne had been sold. James Rutherford needed more field labor and convinced Grayfield to sell Boy Tom for 60 sterling. The transfer would take place the morning after the council meeting. That single transaction erased all illusions. In 3 days, the man she loved would be gone, her own body would be consigned to a breeding program, and the Rice Council would carry on unchallenged. The window was closing. Her decision was final. That night, she met Wayne one last time at the fallen cypress where so many whispered dreams had been shared. They clung to each other in the darkness, compressing years of love and sorrow into fleeting hours. Wayne begged her to flee to take the escape route he had secured and disappear with him into Spanish Florida. "We can live. Be free. We don't have to die here," he pleaded, but Esperanza had already chosen. "Running saves us," she said, her voice steady in their native Portuguese. "But it changes nothing for our people." The clock was set. The plan was in motion. And come June 23rd, those who had trafficked in pain would finally learn what it meant to be afraid. There was still time to flee to Spanish Florida, still a narrow window to escape the horrors of plantation life and start anew. But Esperanza's decision was final. "These men think they're gods," she told Wame. "They believe they can do anything to us without consequence. Tomorrow, I'll show them they're wrong. I'll show them that we are not animals. We are human beings, and human beings fight back." Wayne didn't argue. He had only known her for 2 years, but he had learned to hear the unshakable resolve in her voice. Instead of trying to change her mind, he spent their final hours refining the plan one last time. At sunrise the next day, June 22nd, Esperanza began her final preparations. She conducted a full inventory of the kitchen and storage areas, noting every tool, ingredient, and object that might be useful. She paid special attention to the iron shackles stored in the pantry, typically used to restrain slaves during punishment, and tracked the routines of the other domestic slaves to ensure none would be present when the time came. Part of her mission was vengeance, but she was determined to protect the innocent. She then turned to the furnace. Starting early, she began feeding coal into it at calculated intervals, raising the temperature gradually. On the surface, it looked like preparations for a large meal. But by late morning, the coal furnace, massive, imported, capable of reaching over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, was approaching peak heat, ready to maintain it for hours. No one suspected anything. Esperanza had always been precise, quiet, methodical. Her behavior this morning appeared no different. She polished the crystal glasses that Grayfield kept for impressing guests, cleaned the dining room, and arranged the massive oak table with care. Beneath the surface of this ordinary routine, however, was a plan engineered to turn a simple meeting into a reckoning. By noon on June 23rd, the Rice Council members began to arrive. As expected, Marcus Sutton was the first. He rode up the oak-lined path to the main house with the arrogance of a man who owned over 800 human beings and feared no earthly justice. At 53, Sutton's frame bore the indulgences of wealth, heavy-set, red-faced, and rum-soaked, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. His plantation specialized in seasoning slaves, breaking their minds and bodies until submission became second nature. Slaves too rebellious for other owners were often sent to Sutton, where he applied cruel techniques refined over decades to annihilate resistance. His methods were so effective that planters from all over paid him handsomely for his services. Grayfield greeted Sutton at the door with the empty politeness reserved for peers. The two retired to a private study to discuss delicate business, new methods of slave control, and strategies to lobby the colonial government to relax import restrictions. Over the next hour, the rest of the council trickled in. Carriages and horses filled the drive in a display of colonial power and wealth. Esperanza watched each arrival through the kitchen window silently, memorizing each detail, each face. William Peaton arrived under guard, flanked by armed overseers, an added precaution, since the last rebellion nearly upended his estate. James Rutherford came alone, but the pistol strapped to his saddle made his authority clear. Henry Caldwell rolled up in a lavish carriage, his family crest painted on the side like a royal seal, a visual reminder of his political reach. Each man was greeted with ritualized formality exchanging hollow pleasantries about weather crop yields and the ongoing conflict with native tribes. They saw themselves as builders of civilization, men transforming wilderness into wealth. What they refused to acknowledge was that their empire rested on mass suffering, built by enslaved lives reduced to nothing more than property. Their power existed solely to maintain that system, to make it stronger, more efficient, more permanent. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Edmund Greyfield convened the Rice Council in the estate's grand dining room. 14 men took their seats around a massive English oak table so expensive its cost could have supported an entire colonial household for years. Dozens of candles flickered in silver candelabras, casting warm light over their smug, satisfied expressions. The wealth and power in that room was suffocating. And to them, it was normal. Esperanza moved silently between them, serving food, pouring wine, collecting empty plates, just as she had done for 15 years. Around her, they discussed the brutal logistics of slavery with mechanical precision and casual cruelty, debating labor quotas, punishment protocols, market prices for unbroken Africans. The same conversations she had endured over and over again. But today would be different. Today, she would no longer just listen. Today, the reckoning would begin. But tonight, Esperanza listened with sharper focus. Every word, every inflection, every offhand reference to human suffering took on new weight. The meeting began as it always did with an update on rice prices in the Charleston market and strategies for increasing profits in the upcoming harvest. William Peaton Smug, behind his plate of imported beef, reported record-breaking yields thanks to what he called incentive-based management. It was a system that rewarded slaves with meager food bonuses for exceeding daily quotas and punished underperformance with swift brutality. The key, he explained between bites, is making them believe their comfort depends entirely on how hard they work. Give them just enough hope to keep moving, but never enough stability to make them relax. James Rutherford nodded in agreement. I've had great success with family separation. Nothing drives a man like knowing his wife and children are being held elsewhere, and that seeing them again depends on results. For nearly an hour, the council shared methods for extracting maximum labor from their enslaved workforce while minimizing costs. They spoke of breeding programs like livestock managers planning genetic improvements. They swapped punishment tactics, the way craftsmen might share trade secrets, refining pain into process. Esperanza continued to serve clearing plates, topping off wine, moving silently among them with her usual mask of obedience. But behind that still exterior, she was making her final calculations, measuring each man's position, temperament, and likely response when the moment arrived. When the formal agenda ended, and the mood turned more relaxed, their true nature emerged. Marcus Sutton described with casual pride a new torture device he'd imported from the Caribbean, a narrow iron cage suspended in the sun, slowly roasting its victim alive over days. Samuel Kingsley chuckled as he recounted his latest breeding experiment, forcibly pairing slaves based on physical traits to create stronger future laborers. He referred to them as stock, never once using a name. But it was George Baxter, young, ambitious, and eager to impress, who delivered the final spark. As Esperanza poured the brandy, Baxter raised his glass. "Gentlemen," he announced, "I have a proposal. The Spanish are paying top coin for experienced slaves in South America. I suggest we pool our resources and purchase a ship. We can start exporting our older, less productive stock, turn them into profit before they become dead weight." The room came alive with excitement. They leaned forward, calculating margins and shipping routes, weighing permits and political favors. Some estimated how many could be sold off without crippling their plantations. Others discussed how to make the transactions discreet. To them, it was brilliant strategy, liquidating human lives for higher returns in harsher lands. As Esperanza listened, something inside her finally broke. For years she had told herself there must be limits, even for men like these, that beneath the cruelty there might be a line they wouldn't cross. But there was no line, no humanity, only a machine of exploitation restrained solely by cost and convenience. They would never stop, not unless someone forced them to. At exactly 9:47 p.m., as marked by the imported German clock in Grayfield's dining room, Esperanza de Lima acted. The 14 men had finished their meal and drifted into after-dinner conversation, the air thick with candlelight, sweat tobacco, and the syrupy aroma of fine brandy. They were relaxed, smug, and entirely unaware that their empire was about to fall at the hands of the woman they had ignored for 15 years. Most of the men had relaxed into the comfort of their own delusions, jackets, loosened postures, slouched voices full of confidence. They were now deep in discussion about Samuel Kingsley's proposal to create a formal breeding registry. The idea tracked bloodlines across plantations to engineer a so-called superior class of slaves. Stronger, more obedient, more intelligent. They spoke of eugenics like academics, dissecting soil samples, debating genetics with the same sterile curiosity they brought to crop yields or weather patterns. No one noticed when Esperanza quietly left the room claiming she needed more brandy. No one saw her secure every exit from the house except the kitchen door. And no one realized that the coal furnace, already burning hotter than usual, had been fed all evening to reach its most intense, sustained temperature. Her plan was simple in design, devastating in intent. Over the past days, she had hidden shackles throughout the house, the very restraints used to punish slaves, now repurposed for their masters. She had also prepared a herbal sedative, a formula passed down from her grandmother, that induced unconsciousness within minutes. It had been carefully mixed into the brandy she'd served all evening. As the men continued their conversation about human breeding, the drug began to take effect. George Baxter, having consumed more than the others, was first to falter, his head-swimming body slumping. He thought it was the heat or the alcohol. But soon William Peaton was nauseated, James Rutherford's vision blurred, and Marcus Sutton's hands trembled uncontrollably. Then Edmund Grayfield tried to speak, voice slurring. "Gentlemen, I believe we may have been... Someone has." But he collapsed before finishing the sentence. Within 20 minutes, all 14 men were unconscious. Esperanza moved with silent precision. She shackled each man by the wrists and ankles, using the same devices that had bound thousands of others before them. She made sure they were tight, painful, but not fatal. Mercy had no place in this reckoning. As she worked, she whispered to them in Portuguese, Spanish, and broken English. To James Rutherford, "You sell my Wayne like he is a cow. Tonight you learn what it feels like to be bought and discarded. To Marcus Sutton, you break spirits. I will show you what a broken spirit looks like." And to Edmund Grayfield, her voice ice cold, "You owned me, treated me like an animal. Now you will see what animals do when they are cornered." It took her nearly 3 hours to drag each unconscious body from the dining room to the kitchen. They were heavy, but rage lent her strength. By 2:00 a.m., the Rice Council members were arranged in a perfect circle around the glowing coal furnace feet toward the heat mouths packed with raw cotton to silence them. The temperature in the kitchen was unbearable. The furnace roared like a forge, its heat radiating outward in waves meant not to kill instantly, but to torture slowly. As the first pale light of dawn spilled through the windows, the men began to stir. The sedative had worn off just as Esperanza had planned. One by one they awoke confused, then horrified. Shackled, gagged, drenched in sweat, surrounded by flickering heat and each other. Grayfield was the first to fully register the horror. Then the others followed, thrashing, gagging, moaning through cotton-stuffed mouths. They were experiencing for the first time the helplessness they had inflicted on countless others. Fear without recourse. Suffering with no escape. Esperanza sat in the corner, calmly sharpening her kitchen knives. She had chosen her seat carefully so that every man could see her clearly. She held each of their gazes one by one, making sure they understood exactly who was in control. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said in perfect English, far more fluent than they had ever heard from her before. "I hope you slept well. We have much to talk about, and I want your full attention." She rose and began walking slowly around the circle, eyes, cold posture unshaken. She looked down at each man, the way they had once looked down at the auction blocks in Charleston, appraising human beings with cruel detachment. "For 15 years," she said, "I have served your meals, cleaned your filth, listened to your plans. And now I want you to listen to me." And they did, because they had no choice. "I've heard you speak of my people as if we were cattle to be bought, bred broken, and discarded at your convenience." Esperanza's voice was calm but razor sharp as she began to circle the restrained men. She stopped beside Marcus Sutton, who thrashed violently against his iron shackles. "You, Mr. Sutton, specialize in destroying hope. You take people who still remember being human and teach them to forget. You hollow them out until there's nothing left but obedience. You perfected the art of breaking spirits." She turned to James Rutherford. "And you, your weapon is separation. You tear families apart not out of necessity, but because you've learned that people without love are easier to control. You trade in pain." One by one, she moved around the circle, calling out each man by name, recounting acts of cruelty they had either committed or boasted about in her presence. The more she spoke, the more frenzied their muffled cries became. Each struggled harder, grunted louder, eyes wide with fear. But the iron held. Finally, she returned to Edmund Greefield, the man who had bought her, owned her, and who had set this nightmare in motion. "You, Mr. Greyfield, are the worst of all," she said, voice thick with the fury of 15 years. "You had a choice. You have wealth. You have education. You could have been different. But you chose to be a monster because it was easier, because it was more profitable." She stepped into the center of the circle, the coal furnace behind her glowing like the open maw of hell. "Today you will feel what it's like to be powerless," she said, her voice rising. "Today you will understand what it means to be less than human in the eyes of someone who sees you only as a thing. And you will die slowly awake, aware and with time to reflect on the pain you built your lives upon." What followed over the next 6 hours would never be spoken of openly in Colonial South Carolina. The full truth would be sealed in archives for centuries. But for those who survived to whisper of it, the name Esperanza de Lima would become legend and nightmare. She began with psychological torture, walking the circle like an executioner in no hurry. Her voice steady and emotionless, recounted the horrors she had seen: children torn from screaming mothers, lovers separated forever, men beaten into ghosts of themselves. She mimicked the cold, casual tone the council members used when discussing labor efficiency or disciplinary procedures. "Mr. Peaton," she said, kneeling beside the trembling man. "Do you remember Asher? You purchased her in 1714. She was pregnant. You worked her in the rice fields until she collapsed in labor, then sold her baby before she'd even healed. She cried for 3 days. You had her whipped for keeping you awake." His eyes widened. He remembered. Or perhaps he didn't until now. He had done so much to so many that the cruelty had blurred. But Esperanza had remembered every name, every scream. She turned to Charles Warwick. "You like to watch, don't you, Mr. Warwick? Mr. Warwick, last spring you paid Mr. Greyfield £5 for the privilege of delivering 50 lashes to a runaway. You stretched the punishment out over hours so he wouldn't lose consciousness. You smiled the entire time. The kitchen was an oven. The furnace's heat choked the air. Sweat poured from the men's faces, soaking their expensive waistcoats, mixing with tears. Some were already faltering, short breaths, twitching muscles, eyes unfocused. Heat exhaustion was setting in. But Esperanza wasn't finished. She retrieved a leather-bound ledger from Grayfield's study, a book in which the value of human lives had been calculated like livestock. She opened it and read aloud. April 12th, 1715. Sold boy named Caesar, age 14, to Rutherford Plantation for breeding purposes. £45 sterling. Note: mother became unmanageable after separation. Recommend immediate sale or disposal. She flipped the page. June 3rd, 1715. Female named Rebecca died in childbirth. Child survived. Estimated loss, £20. Note: implement improved nutrition for breeding females to reduce mortality rates. Entry after entry. Names, dates, lives turned into numbers. Esperanza read them with the flat tone of a clerk, balancing accounts mirroring the indifference the council had shown for years. But behind every line there was a face she remembered. A story. A loss. For 2 full hours she kept them in that unbearable heat, forcing them to listen to hear for the first time the consequences of their actions spoken out loud. Each man was forced to confront the brutal calculus of slavery stripped of power, title, and the ability to look away. And this was only the beginning. As the morning sun climbed higher and the kitchen sweltered beyond 120 degrees Fahrenheit, Esperanza moved to the final, most brutal stage of her plan. From the storage room, she retrieved several long iron rods, tools typically used for tending the coal furnace and lifting heavy cookware. She placed them directly into the roaring fire. Within minutes, the metal glowed a furious cherry red, hot enough to blister flesh on contact. She stood before the bound men, her voice calm and composed. You've spent years perfecting how to cause pain without killing. You've studied how to make people suffer while keeping them alive to serve. Today, she said, gripping the first searing rod, your students show you what they've learned. She approached Edmund Grayfield and held the glowing rod inches from his face, close enough for him to feel the heat ripple across his skin. This, she said coldly, is for every human being you've branded like cattle. This is for every soul you've reduced to a possession. What followed was indescribable. The screams that erupted from the Grayfield kitchen echoed across the plantation and beyond. Slaves working in the distant rice fields froze at the sound howls of agony, unlike anything they had ever heard from white men. It wasn't just pain. It was fear. It was helplessness. It was reckoning. Esperanza moved deliberately from one man to the next, applying the iron with precision. She avoided lethal spots, focusing instead on hands, feet, and faces, areas that maximized pain, ensured awareness, and most importantly, left visible scars. These men would bear the marks of their crimes until their last breath. She wasn't killing them yet. She was educating them. Between each application, she continued the psychological assault. She talked about their families, their heirs, their legacies. Your son, William, she whispered to Marcus Sutton as he writhed. He's only 16. Maybe he'll choose a different path. Maybe when he sees what's left of you, he'll understand that cruelty has a cost. This wasn't only torture. It was the systematic dismantling of their identity. These men had built their lives on power superiority and the belief that others existed solely to serve them. Now they were objects, powerless, bound, broken, experiencing the same dehumanization they had inflicted for decades. As the heat in the kitchen crept above 130 degrees, signs of heat stroke became visible. Their faces turned bright red, their skin dried out, their breaths shallow and rapid. But Esperanza had prepared for this. She refused to let them slip into unconsciousness. Using techniques passed down from her grandmother, she pressed wet cloths to their heads and forced spoonfuls of water past the cotton stuffed in their mouths. You must stay awake, she told them softly. Death is a mercy, and you haven't earned mercy. Throughout the hottest part of the day, she continued. The furnace blazed. The irons hissed. The pain escalated. But it wasn't just about physical suffering. It was about turning the entire power dynamic on its head. For the first time in their privileged lives, these men were nothing more than bodies in pain, dependent on the will of someone who saw them not as masters, but as monsters to be unmade. As evening shadows crept across the kitchen floor, Esperanza prepared for the final act. The furnace had been burning at full heat for nearly 18 hours. Now she dragged each man closer, arranging their bodies in a tightening circle around the inferno. 3 feet from the coals, close enough to feel their skin begin to cook. It was a technique Marcus Sutton himself had once described with pride, used to punish runaways through slow, visible suffering. She knelt beside him. "This is how you killed Thomas," she said, her voice low and steady. "The young man who tried to run last summer. You put him in a cage. You let him roast under the sun for 3 days. He begged for water, for shade, for death. You ignored him because you wanted others to see. Now Sutton was the example. One by one, she placed each man within range of the furnace's deadly heat, ensuring they remained conscious long enough to understand that their end was not random. It was earned. With every minute, their skin blistered, their bodies weakened, and their identities unraveled. The true horror wasn't just the pain, it was the knowledge that this was justice. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 24th, 1716, the kitchen of Grayfield Estate held 14 dying men, silent, broken, and aware. The screams had faded hours ago, reduced to ragged breathing and the occasional whimper. Their voices had given out. Their bodies were failing. And for the first and only time in their lives, they knew what it meant to be utterly powerless in the eyes of another. Esperanza de Lima had turned the furnace of their empire into their grave, and they would be remembered not as masters, but as ash. The kitchen reeked of scorched flesh, the air thick with heat, and the ragged sound of dying breath. 14 of South Carolina's most powerful men were reduced to gasping husks, roasting beside the very furnace where they had once demanded meals be prepared by hands they enslaved. Esperanza sat in silence at the kitchen table, methodically sharpening her knives, humming the lullaby her mother had once sung in a village long ago before Portuguese raiders reduced it to ash. Her eyes were distant, no longer focused on the dying men, but her ears remained alert, counting each breath, ensuring that none escaped the pain meant for them. By midnight, the final member of the Rice Council succumbed. Edmund Grayfield lasted the longest, fortified by years of privilege, fine food and medicine denied to those he considered property. His final words were barely audible, a desperate whisper lost in the crackle of burning coal. "Please, I can give you money, freedom, anything." Esperanza looked down at him with the same cold disinterest he had once shown at the Charleston slave market. "I want you to die knowing you were wrong," she said evenly. "You are not superior, not chosen, not a master. You are just a man who chose to be evil. And now you pay." Those were the last words Edmund Grayfield heard. When dawn broke on June 25th, 1716, Grayfield Estate was silent. The first slaves to begin their morning chores entered the kitchen and froze in horror. 14 bodies, blackened and unrecognizable, lay arranged in a perfect circle around the furnace. The air was suffocating, heavy with the stench of death and the lingering heat of vengeance. At the center of it all sat Esperanza de Lima, calmly sharpening a carving knife, her face serene, her lullaby drifting through the smoky air. To those who found her, she showed no fear, no exhaustion, only purpose. They would later say, She looked as though she had finished something, not escaped, not snapped, but completed a task long overdue. When the white overseers arrived, what they found shattered their sense of control. 14 of the colony's most elite planters, dead not in battle, not in a storm or accident, but killed by a single slave woman. The implications were staggering. If one enslaved woman could destroy the foundation of white supremacy in a single night, what could an organized rebellion do? News of the massacre spread within days. It shook the colony to its core. But colonial authorities quickly realized they faced a dilemma. They needed to reinforce the myth of white invincibility, to remind the enslaved that rebellion was hopeless. Yet they couldn't risk letting the truth spread, because the truth was that intelligence, patience, and righteous fury had brought down an empire, not guns or armies. Governor Robert Johnson called an emergency council. After 3 days of deliberation, they chose silence. The records of what became known quietly as the Grayfield Massacre were sealed, locked away in Charleston's archives with a 50-year embargo. To the public, the official story was a tragic kitchen fire during a business meeting. No mention of Esperanza. No mention of revenge. But what to do with her? Public execution would require explanation. A trial would raise questions. Yet letting her live risked turning her into a legend. And so they devised a cruel compromise. Esperanza was sentenced to be sold to a Spanish trader, one known for supplying slaves to the deadly silver mines of South America. A delayed death sentence cloaked as legal punishment. Life expectancy in the mines was less than 2 years. Disease exhaustion cave-ins. It was slow, brutal, and far from public view. But even this wasn't enough for the Colonial Council. Esperanza Alive was too dangerous. Her story, if ever told, could ignite a movement. And so quietly, without a formal decree, it was arranged she would never reach the mines. No record survives of how she died or where. Only whispers. And a name passed from mouth to mouth, across fields and quarters, down generations. Esperanza de Lima, the woman who made them afraid. On July 15, 1716, exactly 3 weeks after the Grayfield Massacre, Esperanza de Lima was loaded onto the Santa Isabella, a Spanish trading vessel bound for Cartagena. Officially, she was listed among 44 enslaved people. Unofficially, the ship's captain had received secret instructions she was not to survive the voyage. Her death was to appear natural, accidental, unremarkable. According to the ship's log, Esperanza died of fever on the 3rd day at sea. She was buried in accordance with maritime tradition overboard, unmarked, her body lost to the ocean. But rumors lingered like smoke. Some of the slaves formerly at Grayfield claimed she had spoken of contingency plans of allies waiting in the Spanish territories who would aid her escape if she could endure the crossing. Others whispered she'd been seen conversing with free black sailors in Charleston Harbor, exchanging coded phrases or slips of paper. Most compelling were the stories from domestic slaves who said Esperanza had spent her final weeks teaching them not just how to cook or clean, but how to heal and how to harm. She taught them anatomy, herbalism, psychology. She taught them how to see the hidden cracks in the plantation system. Justice burns slower than coal, she had told them, but it burns complete. The fire I've started will spread to other kitchens, other plantations, other masters who think they are safe. The colonial authorities moved quickly. They scattered the Grayfield slaves, selling them off in different regions, hoping to fragment any memory of what had happened. But they were too late. The damage had already been done, not just to the men who died in the Grayfield kitchen, but to the illusion of invincibility that the planter class had carefully maintained. In the months that followed, small tremors of unrest rippled across South Carolina. There were no spectacles like Esperanza's calculated retribution, but But something had changed. Plantation houses began to catch fire, first one, then several more. Animals dropped dead from tainted feed. Overseers suffered sudden accidents. Tools vanished from locked sheds only to reappear days later near slave quarters or hidden in field rows. Even more unsettling slaves began displaying knowledge they shouldn't have had intimate details of their masters' routines, finances, and weaknesses. It was as if an unseen intelligence network had taken root, spreading from plantation to plantation, relaying information in whisper songs and silences. The white elite had relied on isolation to keep their system intact. Now that isolation was gone, plantation owners who once strolled confidently through their estates now moved in armed groups, changed their routes daily, and looked over their shoulders. The monthly Rice Council meetings, so essential to maintaining unity and control, were quietly suspended. No one wanted to be in the same room as 13 other men ever again. Some slaveholders responded with concessions. They offered better rations or allowed families to stay together, not from compassion, but out of fear. Others, unwilling to be ruled by fear, doubled down with harsher punishments and tighter control. These were the estates most plagued by resistance. The more they cracked down, the more their slaves seemed to fight back. The colonial government responded with panic, passing new laws that banned gatherings of more than 3 slaves, restricted movement between plantations, and mandated brutal punishments for any slave found with tools that could be used as weapons. But these laws were hard to enforce across such a vast and decentralized system. Instead of suppressing rebellion, they pushed it deeper underground, making it smarter, quieter, more dangerous. And through it all, the name Esperanza de Lima traveled. It passed from mouth to mouth in hushed tones and coded songs. It reached the free black communities of the Spanish territories. It reached the first stirrings of white abolitionist movements and the secret corridors of the early Underground Railroad. Her name became a symbol, not just of revenge, but of possibility, of planning, of power. Historians would later debate whether the Grayfield Massacre was the work of a lone woman consumed by vengeance or the spark that ignited a broader, more systematic resistance. The sealed records made certainty impossible. But circumstantial evidence told another story. In 1739, 23 years after the Grayfield incident, South Carolina witnessed the Stono Rebellion, the largest slave uprising in colonial American history. Whether or not Esperanza's legacy directly influenced it, the spirit was unmistakable. A whisper had become a flame, and that flame, once lit, would never fully go out. Though no direct evidence ever linked the Grayfield Massacre to future uprisings, unsettling patterns began to emerge. Several leaders of the 1739 Stono Rebellion, then the largest slave uprising in colonial American history, had once worked on plantations tied to the Rice Council. The revolt was ultimately crushed, but its message was clear. The psychological aftershocks of Grayfield had not faded. Slaves across the region had learned something more dangerous than hatred. They had learned that their masters were not gods, that they could be studied, outsmarted, made to bleed. They had learned that resistance wasn't a death sentence, it was a possibility. As the colonies shifted under the pressures of revolution, the name Esperanza de Lima began to echo through time. Her story became part of the oral tradition, passed from parent to child, in hushed voices by firelight. Children grew up hearing about the woman who made 14 masters pay. They learned that strength wasn't just muscle, it was memory. That justice could be delayed, but not denied. 50 years after the massacre in 1766, the sealed records in Charleston's archives were finally opened. But by then the colonies were on the brink of war with Britain. Esperanza's story was lost in the tides of revolution, overshadowed, but not forgotten. For a while the historians debated whether she had been a lone avenger or the spark of something larger the people who mattered already knew. The system she struck had begun to rot from within. That same year, a Spanish clerk aboard a vessel docking in Cartagena recorded a strange encounter. He had met a Portuguese-speaking woman, spirited and articulate, who claimed she had once burned down a plantation from the inside. She spoke of first lessons and of fires that would spread. He did not write her name, but others in whispers said it was her. Whether or not Esperanza de Lima survived the voyage aboard the Santa Isabella no longer mattered. What mattered was that her story had survived. By 1720, just 4 years after the Grayfield Massacre, reports of coordinated sabotage and resistance spread throughout South Carolina. Kitchen fires, poisoned livestock, dead overseers, tools vanishing and reappearing with purpose, slaves demonstrating knowledge of their owners' lives that went far beyond their duties. An invisible network seemed to stretch between plantations, information moving through coded songs, stolen glances, and shared silence. Masters began to fear what their property might know. Monthly rice council meetings ceased. Plantation owners traveled only under guard. Some tried softening their treatment to buy loyalty. Others, terrified, escalated cruelty, only to spark more accidents, more slowdowns, more disappearances. The balance had shifted. The old order had fractured. Colonial authorities passed harsh new laws to crack down. But fear is harder to regulate than fire, and through it all, Esperanza's name endured. A myth, a truth, a warning. She had done what no one thought possible, executed justice, with nothing but patience, knowledge, and iron resolve. Whether she perished at sea or vanished into the Spanish territories to continue her quiet war, she had already changed everything. The kitchen at Grayfield stood abandoned for over 60 years. No slave would enter it. Overseers refused to sleep within its walls. Eventually the house was demolished, swallowed by vines and silence. But its memory lived on. The story was passed down in whispers. Those who treat people as property do so at their own peril. Because property can learn, property can plan, property can wait, and when pushed beyond the breaking point, property fights back. Justice burns slower than coal, but it burns complete. What do you think was the full truth ever revealed? Or are there still secrets buried in the archives of our nation's dark past? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts on this chilling tale of resistance and retribution. If you found this story as gripping as we did, make sure to subscribe, ring the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear the stories history tried to erase. History may be written by the victors, but sometimes the voices of the victims rise up and burn through centuries of silence. See you in the next episode, where we continue uncovering the dark truths that shaped America. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.